So, in the first session, I spoke about how I came to settle upon my presidential theme, attentive to rhythms of grace, and I related my experience of seeing a kingfisher for the first time, how I was prepared to travel to see one, but then saw one very close to our home. I've heard one kingfisher story from among you so far, but I'm very pleased to hear further kingfisher stories when you have them. I spoke about how this was a gift, a moment of grace, and how it's changed the way that I walk the parkland, always watching for the kingfisher, and how this is a beautiful picture of how we might live, watching for God, looking for God, noticing God, being attentive to rhythms of grace. And I shared how subsequently this has taken on further significance in two ways, one global and the other personal. The first because of coronavirus, and the second because of my own situation. In this session, I want to speak very personally from my experience over this last 18 months and where I now find myself. And I hope for you to reflect on your experience over these 22 months and where you now find yourselves. All of our experiences are different. Some are more extreme, others less so. But I believe that there's much common ground. And while my particular experience is likely to be very different to yours, I think, I do hope that we will find some connection. Now, the title I've given to my talk is Surgical Stockings and Pull-Up Pants. And I've got another bit to add on to that. Surgical stockings, pull-up pants, and the gift of tears. During my stay in hospital in April following stem cell transplant, on one occasion, and I was in Oxford, I was in the Churchill. On one occasion, I returned from the ensuite bathroom, a place I visited frequently. And I sat in the chair and I caught a glimpse of myself in the full-length mirror opposite. And there confronting me was a very thinned out version of myself wearing surgical stockings and pull-up pants. For someone who has always enjoyed clothes and liked to dress well, this was a shock, to say the least. The look was definitely not the velvet jacket and tight jeans of my late teens. Nor was it the Yves Saint Laurent double-breasted blazer of my early 20s, which cost me a fortune. And it wasn't the nearly new Giorgio Armani suit in which I was ordained, which had reputedly belonged to Jonathan Ross, and which I bought for a bargain in a dress agency in Lincoln in 1990. It wasn't any of these looks, but it was a true image of where I was at that time, and maybe a metaphor for my experience. Surgical stockings and pull-up pants. As I say, if I were to add another image, it would be tears. My friend Jeannie Kendall has recently launched a book with the evocative title. I think Jeannie was with you yesterday, wasn't she? She's recently launched a book with the evocative title, Held in Your Bottle, and it's on the importance of tears. It's a good book. I commend it to you, and I had the privilege of a sneak preview which came about because of a conversation with Jeannie about my own experience of tears. You see, up until the last year and a half, tears have been only an occasional feature of my life. It's not that I don't feel emotions strongly, and often when I'm moved, my eyes fill up and they spill over. But there haven't been that many occasions when I've had what I would call a proper cry. And this is evidenced by the fact that I can recall most of those occasions individually and tell the story around them. Well, that was until July 2020. During June of that year, I developed back pain, which grew progressively worse. And I went for an MRI scan, and I expected to hear from the consultant the following week. So it came as a shock when I was referred immediately to Milton Keynes University Hospital Accident and Emergency with multiple compression fractures in my back and my ribs. I mentioned Spike Milligan earlier on. You may know that when Spike Milligan died, he had on his gravestone, "I told you I was ill." Well, at that time, I wanted to say, "I told you my back hurts." It was sort of gratifying to get some kind of explanation for why things were how they were. After a number of tests, within 3 days, I was given the news that I had a condition which was the cause of the fractures, spinal myeloma, a blood cancer, which I was told is highly treatable, but also terminal. This turned my life and the life of my family upside down. I recall speaking to Kaz, who wasn't allowed to visit because of COVID, and then my 2 sons, Jonathan and Andrew, my sister Hilary, and then my mum. All hugely difficult conversations and accompanied by copious tears for all of us. And for me, this was the beginning of a new experience, as though a floodgate had opened. My tears were understandable on account of my trauma and possibly the relief that finally I knew what was the matter with me. And also because my future, all my expectations and all my intentions were now in limbo. COVID-19 had shown the world within a matter of weeks how unpredictable life is, but my personal circumstances had almost sidelined the global pandemic with my own huge uncertainties. And I was asking questions such as, will I be alive at Christmas? What is my life expectancy? What does highly treatable mean? And what about my back and the concern that was being expressed about the compression fractures on my spinal cord with the possible loss of feeling to my lower body? Within days I started chemotherapy, which was continuous, but over a long period of time, so it was quite tolerable in the early stages. Were it not for the condition of my back, I would have been discharged and treated as an outpatient. However, complications with my back meant that I had to be fitted for a custom-made back brace. The one that I had been wearing was declared by my consultant as a RoboCop job. And this resulted in an extended stay in hospital with strict bed rest while I waited to be ambulanced to Stanmore Hospital in North London to have a cast made and then the brace fitted. It was a thing that went all the way around me and came up to my chin, so it was very, very constricting. My tears continued, not with their initial torrent, but in any conversation I could easily dissolve. It wasn't that I felt sorry for myself, and I felt no need to apologise. I didn't feel angry, which troubled me because I thought that I ought to. I mean, after all, I was a pastoral specialist that knows about these things. But the tears just kept coming. Experiences of kindness and care, of which there were many, triggered them, as could praying the Order for Baptist Ministry daily office, reading scripture, a poem or a book, music, which in ordinary times causes my eyes to moisten, resulted in an overflow. But what was the strangest experience was that every morning I would wake up, and even before my mind was engaged, I would find myself crying. I was dealing with a huge sense of loss, actual and anticipated, and I was on morphine and a cocktail of other drugs. But underlying all this was the realization that I had become vulnerable like never before. Prior to going into hospital, I was independent and self-sufficient, with a personality which expresses itself through being organised and planned and structured and in control and getting things right where possible. I'm a great enthusiast of the Enneagram, and I look forward to exploring this a bit with you later on today. The type that I come out as is the perfectionist. And here I found myself in a hugely imperfect place, seemingly with my life taken out of my hands, not knowing what the future held, not able to even move my position in bed without assistance, and needing help with all the basic functions of life. Now I have to say there was humour. On one occasion, a nurse who I hadn't met before came into my room while I was being bathed, and I was in a position for my back and my bottom to be washed. And she commented with some hilarity that it was unusual to be introduced to a person's bottom before their face. I was deeply moved to think that my newly born grandson, Charlie, and I were in the same situation of having our nappies changed. At one and the same time, I found myself accepting of this and held fast by the love that will not let me go. But recognizing that everything had changed, at least for the present. I was vulnerable in a wholly new way, and my tears were expressing this frequently, involuntarily, occasionally out of frustration, but most simply at what was. Being discharged from hospital, the tears continued, though not with the same intensity, but my vulnerability was plainly apparent. I looked like a stormtrooper in my back and neck brace. I mean, all I needed was a helmet, and I was now officially registered as disabled. I needed to sleep in a hospital bed downstairs, and I had carers come in first thing in the morning to wash me. My mobility was very limited, and the only time I went out was to go to the cancer centre for supplementary treatment to my daily chemotherapy. Well, the back brace came off at the beginning of November 2020. That was a moment of great rejoicing. And the chemo finished a month later. At the beginning of 2021, I was declared in remission for the myeloma. And then the process of stem cell transplant began with the mobilisation of my stem cells and then their harvesting. This was delayed because of further lockdown, but it took place eventually in April, and it necessitated another 3-week period in hospital. A friend and a Baptist minister with experience as a nurse said, she said, stem cell transplant isn't for sissies, is it? And she was right. The actual procedure only takes 3 days. They insert a PICC line one day, and then on the next day they give you a massive dose of chemotherapy, and then the third day they give you back your stem cells. It was described to me by one nurse as, we have killed you and now we will bring you back to life. During week 1 you wait for the effects of the chemo to kick in, and by week 2 you wait for the infections to occur, which are inevitable without any immune system, and then they bring you back to life with all the sort of medication that they've got on hand. The first reading of my immune system, which of course was totally wiped out, the first reading of a 0.3 was a cause of great celebration. It's not much, is it? 0.3, but it shows that things were going in the right direction. But catching that glimpse of myself dressed in surgical stockings and pull-up pants, it captured the moment. See, my vulnerability had clothes. In 1977, a book was published by the author W.H. Vanstone, an Anglican priest theologian, with the title, Love's Endeavour, Love's Expense. And this is one of those books that has been a companion throughout my ministry. At the end of the book is a poem which has also become a hymn based on the book and with the same title. You can find it online. But it has this verse which, reflecting on God's gifts in creation and creativity, begins, "Open, Lord, are these thy gifts. gifts of love to mind and sense. But it continues, and in contrast, hidden is love's agony, love's endeavour, love's expense. Hidden is love's agony, love's endeavour, love's expense. And Vanstone explores the phenomenology of love. And he does so by firstly examining inauthentic love. Inauthentic love as having the marks of limitation, of control, and of detachment. And he goes on, and he does this by way of many examples, but he goes on to explore authentic love as being, by contrast, without limitation, precarious, and vulnerable. Love's agony, love's endeavour, love's expense. And this has had a profound effect upon my understanding of God and also upon my pastoral practice. It's not an entirely easy read, but I think it's a worthwhile one. And then Vanstone wrote another book called The Stature of Waiting, which again has been highly significant for me. Over the years I've referred to it a number of times, especially in the season of Advent with its emphasis upon waiting. But it was to become extremely personal. In this book, Vanstone describes the gospel accounts of Jesus' life as falling into two phases. The first phase of dynamic, inexhaustible activity interspersed with times of silence and prayer. And then a second phase, a contrasting phase of passivity, of waiting. And the turning point is in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Judas betrays Jesus to forces beyond his control, and the passion commences. And Vanstone makes much of the particular word that's used in the Greek, challenging the notion that it means betrayed, but rather handed over. Judas hands over Jesus. And at this significant juncture, Jesus is no longer the initiator. He is no longer free to go where he chooses. Now his hands are tied, literally, and he is at the disposal of others. Jesus is not the one who does, but the one who is done to. Vanstone takes this theme and eloquently relates it to the pattern of our own lives, especially for those who are growing older and those suffering the handicap of illness, showing that they have no less value as human beings. And importantly, he shows that this is indeed the nature of God, reflected in Jesus. Now, this has brought me huge comfort and strength and caused me once again to reflect deeply on the vulnerability of God, a central feature of my theology. One of my most often used quotations is, "The crucified Jesus is the only accurate picture of God that the world has ever seen." It's by John Austin Baker. "The crucified Jesus is the only accurate picture of God that the world has ever seen." The whole of Jesus' earthly life is marked with vulnerability when you look at it. Most noticeably in the incarnation and at the crucifixion. And at the resurrection which we celebrate. What's striking about the risen Christ is that he continues to bear the scars. John, in his Revelation, has a vision. We might expect a vision of a lion, but no, it's of a lamb that had been slaughtered. Apart from my most recent stay in hospital, when I managed to get something which was not related to cancer, but because I'm immunosuppressed, I'm presently in remission and I'm progressing really well. My personality, which I mentioned earlier, has not undergone a radical transformation. I'm still that same person with the perfectionist tendencies, who wants to rearrange the dishwasher and would much happier be with 10 minutes of silence than 9, okay? But I do recognise that all of these different ways that we have of being in the world can be stripped away in an instant. In this respect, I am and expect to be aware of my vulnerability for the rest of my life. And although the consultant speaks of several years of remission, I hear of people in a similar situation who've been in remission for 10 years and more, and I'm hopeful. My condition is ultimately incurable, and it may be far less. That's the nature of it. But this is the thing. I think that this vulnerability, together with the accompanying tears, is on balance a gift of grace, which is to be embraced. I need to be very clear, I'm not thankful for the myeloma, which I consider a most unwelcome guest in my body. But for those parts of my God-given humanity, what it means to be me, that it's opened up and continues to do, I'm immensely grateful. My life for the past 64 years has not been without some experience of suffering and loss, but that's been limited in comparison to the last 18 months, which has deepened that experience in ways I couldn't have imagined. And it includes my experience of God with me, which, as I've said, has at times been beautiful and precious, something that I will never forget. Significantly, it's connected me with others who tread a similar path or some other very difficult one, with whom I have a much greater appreciation and with whom I am able to weep, literally, sometimes literally. To attend the cancer centre as an outpatient is to be surrounded by people who all belong to the same club. Some quite old, others very young, some looking pretty healthy, and others looking very ill. And sometimes in the midst I have a strong sense of the Lord is here, His Spirit is with us. We talk about resilience in ministry a lot. And while I think this is important, and only recently I've spoken about it, I have found myself unable to talk about resilience in ministry without also talking about vulnerability in ministry. It seems to me that they cannot be separated if we follow a vulnerable God. Michael Buckley, who's a Jesuit, begins an article writing in an American context. There is a tendency among us Americans, common and obvious enough, recommended by common sense and successful practice, to estimate a person's aptitude for a profession or for a career by listing their strengths. The tendency is to transfer this method of evaluation to the priesthood. I think that transfer is disastrous. There is a different question, one proper to the priesthood as of its very essence, if not uniquely proper to it. Is this person weak enough to be a priest or a minister? Is this person weak enough to be a priest or a minister? Now, while we don't seek vulnerability, there is an inevitability that it will come to us in the ordinary course of our lives and ministry, and possibly in ways which are extraordinary. How then do we view it? And how do we respond to it when it comes? Might vulnerability be seen in some way as gift of God, as it opens up our humanity and as it draws us to God? And might it be part of that process of growing into the likeness of Christ, the vulnerable Christ? Well, these are some of the questions I'm reflecting on. And my experience is one in which I've sought to be attentive to rhythms of grace, albeit in a way I could never have imagined at the beginning of 2020, and when I was elected to be president of the Baptist Union. But in this experience, I've seen the kingfisher. As a final note, I'm pleased to report that at present I am no longer wearing surgical stockings and pull-up pants.
Praise God!
But I do continue to cry a fair bit. I am in remission, and I'm on a maintenance programme that's only just become available on the NHS, which will extend remission even further, hopefully following stem cell transplant. For this, I'm hugely grateful to medical science and to God. I really am, and as I said in my opening session, I'm so grateful to the prayers of those in the Baptist family for me and my family. I've been very personal with you in this session, and I hope you haven't found this overly indulgent. This is my story, but while I heard about the Central Baptist Association Ministers Conference back in October, which I wasn't able to be at because I'd just come out of hospital again, was that there was a common experience of vulnerability among those who were present. It was quite tangible. So I wonder about your story as you look back over the experience of the pandemic and at the place in which you now find yourself, attentive to rhythms of grace. Where have you watched for, and where have you seen the kingfisher in these very challenging times?